Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second week of February and our second week of Black History Month. Wanted to continue kind of what we did a little bit last week and talk about, we'll call them some unsung heroes of American history. And again, there's a lot of, Black and African American, people throughout American history that have really had a profound impact on our culture, our history, and things like that. But, obviously there's a lot of famous names out there. But, for this month, I wanted to focus on some names that maybe you haven't heard or maybe you've heard less about, but have had just as great an impact on American culture as people that we've definitely heard about. Obviously, Martin Luther King Jr., Jackie Robinson, Rosa Parks. I mean, obviously all giant names in American history and had profound impact on American culture. But again, there's other African Americans and other Black individuals who have had just as big an impact. Maybe we don't know their stories as much. So wanted to take today again and focus on a couple more individuals that I think have really done something that really made a difference in our culture. And I want to start with a gentleman by the name of Ronald Mcnair. Ron was 9 years old in 1959 when he went to a library in South Carolina, and the librarian told him he could not check out books because the library was segregated. He refused to leave. When he was so determined to read the books there that he sat down on the counter and refused to leave. So the librarian called the police and called his mom. When the police got there, they realized he wasn't doing anything. He just wanted to read books. So they told the librarian to let him check out books, and he was able to walk out with his mother with the books that he had checked out. And he was so inspired by what had happened to him in the situation. It created this lifelong love of learning. And he actually went on to earn a PhD in physics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. And he was actually one of the first 3 African Americans selected by astronauts by NASA. So again, he was one of the first Black astronauts in American history. And again, his very first space flight, he maneuvered the robotic arm, which allowed another astronaut to perform a spacewalk without being actually tethered to the spacecraft. He was the first person to ever do this. I mean, again, just an amazing accomplishment. Well, you may actually have heard the name Ronald Mcnair and then not even realized it. And the reason was, that was his first space flight that I just described. Well, his second space flight, he was one of the 7 astronauts who was killed aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger when it exploded in takeoff in 1986. Everyone on board was killed after 73 seconds in the air. Again, obviously, it's obviously a very, very famous explosion. The teacher, I apologize, I've forgotten her name, who was on board, obviously got a lot of the credit or a lot of the recognition for being this teacher in space. But again, Ronald McNair was actually one of those astronauts who was on that spacecraft. So again, incredibly tragic end to his life. And actually, after that had happened, the library in South Carolina where he was refused the books is now named after him. So again, just an amazingly, a great man who accomplished quite a bit after experiencing extreme segregation when he was a young boy. So. Again, and actually, the second person I want to mention is kind of keeping with aviation theme is, we've all probably heard of Amelia Earhart, who broke barriers for women in flight, and Amelia is often celebrated for her piloting heroics. But there's another woman, an African American woman by the name of Bessie Coleman, who broke down barriers for women in aviation. So. Ms. Coleman actually took flight up in 1921, and she became the first African American woman to earn a pilot's license, all the way back in 1921. Excuse me. She was inspired to take, to fly after her brother, who was a World War I veteran, came back from France and told her that women in France were superior because a lot of women in France could fly, and it was very, very limited in the United States. So despite her drive, she was denied flying privileges in the U.S. because she was a Black woman. So for the longest time. But she was so determined to become a pilot that she began learning French at home before leaving for Paris to learn how to be a pilot. So she earned her pilot's license and then in France, and then she returned home, and she was the first public flight by a Black woman in the U.S. in a plane that she had borrowed. So the first ever actual flight by a woman, it was a Black woman in the U.S. by the name of Bessie Coleman. She was so good at what she did, she actually took up what they call barnstorming, which is kind of, a form of entertainment involving, aerial stunt tricks. And we've all seen, those planes that can kind of go up and then come down. She does all these tricks, and she was so good at it, but she was trying this really dangerous, this really dangerous stunt in April of 1926, she began nosediving and couldn't come back up. And while she was doing this, she wasn't wearing her seatbelt, and she was thrown from the aircraft, and she was killed, unfortunately. So really, again, a really, really tragic end. But again, we all know about Amelia Earhart, but Bessie Coleman did just as much, if not more, to advance not only Black women, but women in general into the aviation field. So again, Bessie Coleman, a name that we should definitely know in American history. And the last individual I want to talk about today is a gentleman by the name of Robert Smalls. So he was in his early 20s when he risked his life as a Black enslaved man in the U.S. South to sail his family to freedom in the North. That was his sole purpose of what he wanted to do. Because, as so many other families were, he was haunted by the idea that his family, his wife and his kids could be sold and separated, which was very common practice during slavery. So he didn't want his family to be separated. So he had this really kind of unique plan. So in the spring of 1862, and kind of in the middle of the night, right in the heart of the Civil War, he and a crew of fellow slaves stole one of the Confederacy's most crucial gunships from its wharf in the South Carolina port of Charleston. He himself was actually he had learned how to be a maritime pilot, during some certain times. And when he had learned to become a pilot, his crew actually hijacked. This ship was called the Uss Planter. Huge ammunition ships, one of the biggest in the Confederate fleet. And they snuck onto the ship after the white officers had left overnight and left the ship unattended. So him and his crew sailed the vessel, which is about 16 passengers, into free waters in the North. And when they got there, he actually handed it over to the Union Navy to use against the Confederacy. And obviously this is shocked the world. This was one of the biggest stories at the time when this happened, when they found out when they did it. And as you can imagine, he was hailed as a hero in the North, and obviously as a great trader in the South. You can see the differences. But again, a name that is so often forgotten, because when he did this, he was one of the first individuals to help lobby President Lincoln to allow Black men to enlist in the Union Army. So again, Lincoln was always kind of on the fence with this, but when this happened, Lincoln saw how critical it was to have African American men enlist in the Army to help with the war effort. So again, this small little thing, I guess it was a big thing, of stealing the ship and getting it to the North, helped convince Lincoln that Black men should be allowed into the Army. So, and actually after the war ended, Mr. Smalls was actually one of the first African American men to serve in the U.S. House of Representatives. So again, just a giant of history, and had he not done what he did and gotten that ship to the North, maybe history would have been different. Maybe President Lincoln would have waited longer to have Black men in the Army, which could have tilted the scales of the Civil War. So again, just a giant of history that most of us had probably never even heard of. So. Well, again, I hope you enjoyed kind of hearing these three stories. Again, some really unsung heroes of not just Black history, but American history in general. So we'll continue this theme throughout February and learning about individuals who maybe we're less familiar about. But again, I hope you enjoyed today's story, and we will talk soon.